Richard, welcome to the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael.
You've been beating this drum for a while, haven't you?
Well, since before the election. So before the election, we were noticing that a lot of farmers were coming under pressure from their banks. We do a 6-monthly banking survey or rural banking survey, and we're noticing that there's a lot of sentiment out there that farmers were feeling under pressure. Banks were sort of treating them differently to the way that they were expecting, and so we started saying, well, maybe there's something in this, maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper, and started asking for an inquiry then. We got quite a few political parties sort of saying, yes, we're quite interested in this. We even had the former Minister of Agriculture, Damien O'Connor, saying he thinks it's a great idea. The only reason he hasn't given us one is that we never asked for one. So we thought, well, hell, we probably better get on and ask for one. So, we're doing it for a while. In late February, we wrote to the Primary Production Select Committee and said, look, we'd love for you to do an inquiry into rural banking. We think there are some questions that really need to be answered. And they have opened a briefing into rural banking and have taken submissions from us, a few other rural organisations and the banks, and they're in the process of deciding whether or not to turn that into a full inquiry.
Okay. Now let's just go through some I've read your press release, I think, that came out earlier this year on this issue. And let's just take some of those statistics and put them out into the public, because
Sure.
This will give you non-rural folk a bit of an understanding. Currently, Kiwi farmers, you say, are carrying around $63 billion worth of debt. So it's a lot of money. That they are paying an average overdraft interest rate of 10.1% as of May last year. I don't know what that would be now, but that's obviously up considerably on what it has been. And you're also saying that the average interest rates that have been charged farmers are actually considerably higher than the interest rates that have been charged for mortgages in this country and other business lending. Do you suspect, can I ask you, Richard, that there's a bit of cross-subsidisation happening here where farmers are paying a greater so that banks can be more competitive in the mortgage interest rate area?
Well, that's certainly one of our suspicions, and part of the reason we'd like to have this inquiry. Well, we're not banking experts, but we do see there being a significant difference, a couple of percent in what farmers are paying versus what you can get for a residential mortgage. And we'd love to understand a bit more about that and see if it's all fair and reasonable and what can potentially be done about it.
Well, have you not asked the banks? You've just rung up BNZ and said, hey, mate, what's the story? Why are you charging us more than you are charging homeowners?
Yeah, no, I meet with the banks quite regularly in the Bankers Association. And so what we've got is an interesting situation where the banks point the finger at the Reserve Bank and say, look, it's the Reserve Bank's capital requirements, which we certainly think there's a part there. The Reserve Bank points the finger right the way back and says, no, it's the banks, taking excessive profits. So, like I said, we just want an inquiry to effectively work out what's going on here, because everyone's blaming each other, right? And farmers are suffering in the middle of it all.
Right. That would be annoying, being passed between the Reserve Bank and the banks as to who is creating the problem. But nonetheless, there is a problem. I mean, do the banks say, well, despite that, we can still charge or give home interest rates lower by, as you say, 2% or maybe even more than we can charge rural folk?
Yeah, so a lot of this does come down to capital requirements as well. To be fair to the banks on this, the Reserve Bank requires the banks to hold more capital for rural lending than they do for residential lending, and they're actually in the process of requiring banks to hold even more. So back in 2019, Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank decided in their wisdom to make sure that the New Zealand financial system could withstand a 1 in 200 year financial shock. And part of that was increasing capital requirements for rural lending. And so the figures based on that, the banks have said that would increase the interest rates for ag lending by between 0.5 and 1.2%, which in the context of farming would be between $310 and $720 million per year, essentially going out of the ag sector. So farmers would have to generate that money, pay it to the banks, and because the banks are borrowing that money largely from offshore, in order to hold those extra reserves. That money just goes straight out the gate, or straight out of the country overseas. So there's no real benefit to the country. And you've got to ask at some point is, yes, we want a resilient financial system, but is this being overly conservative at the cost of the ag sector?
Listen, if you get a 1 in 200 years shock to the financial system, New Zealand won't survive anyhow, so it's just ridiculous. Can I just say, the other thing that strikes me as interesting is, you say in your press release, the Bank of New Zealand is the first bank to announce a target in New Zealand to do with reducing the level of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And in actual fact, they've stated an aim, this is the Bank of New Zealand, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farming by 11% in the next 6 years. I'm sorry, but are they a bunch of wankers, or do they actually have that power to tell dairy farmers, you're going to reduce your greenhouse emissions by 11% and use financial tools to do so?
Yeah, look, I think everyone's about sick of organisations setting targets for them to achieve, and then sort of inflicting them upon them for some reason. And I really question what the role of banks is or should be within this. But where this all actually comes from is the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which a few years ago, basically a whole lot of financial institutions got together and decided that they were going to help tackle climate change and signed this agreement that they would decrease the emissions portfolio, or the emissions of their lending portfolios. And so BNZ have signed up to this in their own right, whereas the other major banks have signed up to it via their parent banks, who are obviously Australian banks. So we've essentially got all of the banks having done this, and they're in the process of setting emissions reduction targets for the ag sector, which is a real concern. And I really do question it from the point of view of New Zealand sovereignty, amongst other
Absolutely.
things. Is it right for us to have these banks operating in this way and inflicting it upon, what we'll call the backbone of the economy?
But that's not for them to set policy on this. This is wank stuff. This is, as you say, this is authoritarian usury stuff. It's for the government to determine what the policies are going to be, surely, and that's why we elect a democracy, I would have thought. It's not for banks to come in and say, well, okay, dairying, you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 11%, and then we'll set our lending policies accordingly. At what stage does that happen?
Yeah, look, like I said, it's a big concern of ours, and we've raised it a few times, and we're hoping that this inquiry is going to have a good look into that as well, and see, basically see what's appropriate in this space. I have no problem with individual banks deciding to make commercial decisions, but when they're all getting together and signing a collective agreement to do something, then, amongst other things, you'd have to argue that that's anti-competitive. But if individual banks do it, then me as a farmer can say, well, hang on, I'm not up for that, so I'm going to go to a different bank, or I can say, hey, this is all me, I think this is fantastic, and I can stick with that bank, right? But when they're all doing it, as farmers, we have no choice.
Yeah, no, I understand, and that would make me aggrieved too. In fact, I'm angry just thinking about it. All right, so you've gone to the select committee. Is it the Primary Production Select Committee, is it? Is that the one that we...
That's correct, yep.
Yep. And they've now gathered that information, and presumably, but they'll have a majority on that select committee will be from National Act and New Zealand First. What have been the indicative policy positions of those three parties on this matter?
Yeah, good question. So all the MPs on the select committee, when we spoke to them, asked some really engaging questions, and reading their comments in the public space, like in the media, they all seem to think that there are some questions that need to be answered. I think the Greens were actually particularly supportive, which was really good. Even though we don't always agree on everything, to be fair, that they seem to see there being an issue there. Same with Labor as well, and then obviously the other representatives are part of the government, so you'd have to think they'd be behind us as well, to be fair.